welcome back to Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today at Folio in downtown Seattle is Canadian novelist Marina Endicott. Marina, thank you so much for joining me. You're in Saskatoon now, I understand.
I am deep in the deep freeze here. We've had a big snowstorm and we're still trying to dig ourselves out.
Your new book, The Voyage of the Morning Light, I have to say, I just thought was absolutely brilliant. So moving and so honest and so important. But I was really interested to see that in Canada, where the book came out first, it was called The Difference. And here in the States, it's the Voyage of the Morning Light. Which title do you think best gives a sense of the book?
It's funny because titles are so complicatedly linked up with marketing, and The Difference was my working title for the novel as I was going. And it didn't occur to me that they would let me stick with it. But my lovely editor at Knopf Canada thought it was the right title for the book. I had it as a working title to remind myself constantly of what I was looking at, the perception of difference, and how good we are at perceiving that difference, and how we might be able to stop noticing it, or at least eradicate it from our subconscious. And then when it was coming out in the States, my lovely editor at W.W. Norton felt that it would be good to have, it was right at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think she was looking for a title that would convey the joy of the book, the pleasure of the travel. And so I think The Voyage of the Morning Light, I almost said The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, isn't that funny? So, because that's the book that most comes to my mind, and it was probably my favorite of the Narnia books. So The Voyage of the Morning Light gives that sense of a voyage. We will be going on a journey together. And maybe there'll be some pleasure in it, which I think is excellent for a book, particularly in these dark and closed-in times, to be able to travel.
To sail away on a merchant ship to the South Seas. So would you describe the book for the viewers and listeners?
I'm so bad at that. I always feel that if I could describe it, I wouldn't have to write the book. But but it's two sisters, one almost 20 years older than the other, half sisters. The younger has terrible nightmares, and so ends up being taken along on her sister's honeymoon voyage with a sea captain, and they sail from Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, which was a huge shipping center, down into the South Seas and to China. And on their voyage, they are working through their some shadows from their past. And so they are both involved in looking at the world and seeing these wonders that they pass through, but also at trying to understand how we can be better people, and whether that lies through benevolence, through a kind of a charitable bossiness, or whether it doesn't. And the younger sister comes to believe that it doesn't.
Do you, for me, this book still has so much resonance and importance in the world today. And that decision that the characters make, and the difference between the two sisters and their choices of how to move through the world, has seemed to me to be the kind of decision that we all have to make.
Yeah. And we I guess we base those decisions on the rules we've accepted in our lives. And when I started thinking about the book, I don't know if you realize this, I'm sure you do, but it's based on a real event. My piano teacher's mother. When I was a child, my piano teacher had been brought up on a clipper ship, and her mother, on her honeymoon voyage, sailed into the South Seas and bought a little boy for 4 pounds of tobacco. And when I first heard this story, when I was quite old, in my late 30s, 40s, I heard that story for the first time, and I was so horrified by it, um, taken aback, really, because this was only 1 degree of separation from me. This was my teacher's mother. Um, I, I wanted to write the story. I felt it was too difficult and maybe not my story to write, because of the appropriation of this child from the South Seas. But then I was so lucky, I won the Commonwealth Prize for Canada, and I was taken to New Zealand for the prize. And then the Commonwealth Foundation said, would you like to go to Tonga to do some outreach? And of course I said yes. But there I was in Tonga doing 10 days of workshops with children, and they were this child that had been appropriated, absconded with by this woman I knew, this woman of whom I am one. And whether I like it or not, that is what my legacy, my heritage is too, of a long string of religious people, Anglicans mostly, and people who consider themselves to be pretty correct and pretty superior. And so it seemed when I was there, it began to seem like a kind of cowardice not to tackle that, not to look from the boy's point of view, but to look from the woman's point of view. And so I originally intended it to be just the woman. But I found when I was thinking about it and writing it that what I needed was someone who had not already made up her mind about the rules, someone who had not completely bought lock, stock, and barrel every teaching of the church, who did not completely believe that it was a good thing to march into somebody else's country and try to change their way of life and their beliefs. So I found myself needing Kay, the younger sister, and needing her clarity of eye, to be able to look at things differently, because she, growing up in the residential school where her sister is a teacher and her father is the principal, she is really a child, more one of the children than she is one of the people, the rulers.
Right. And the residential school, I mean, what gives it an added layer of irony is that the residential school where Kay is and where her sister teaches and her father, as you say, is the principal, is a residential school for Indigenous peoples, kids. And I was reading somewhere that these schools, which were both in the United States and Canada, really were to take the red out of those children and to make them acceptable.
It's an actual quote from Parliament, where Sir John A. Macdonald, the Prime Minister at the time, talked about taking the Indian out of the child.
Yeah.
And that was the stated intent. At the time, you can make lots of excuses for them because they believed that this was going to do these children good, that they would be able to function in the white world. I think those excuses are specious and wrong, and were wrong at the time. And what actually ended up happening was that children were wrenched away from their families, their language was stripped from them, their understanding of child rearing was taken away. They were put in orphanages, basically, by force, and left there. And the system continued into the 1990s in Canada. This is not, I've come to believe, we had a Truth and Reconciliation commission that went across the country, and I applaud their efforts, absolutely. But I've sort of come to believe that you can't even really forgive that. Mm-hmm. How can we forgive that? How can people whose language was taken from them and whose ability to parent was taken because they weren't parented? It was so devastating to that multiple communities that I don't think it can be forgiven. I think it has to be just lived with and moved along from. And I don't really know exactly how we do that, except by lots and lots of work. And I'm not up on how things are going in the States, but I know that in Canada
I would say badly. Does Kay forgive her sister or herself that this little boy Aaron is her brother?
I don't know. It's such a good question, and I think it's what I hope you wonder.
Right. I think that I'm always on the lookout for good books for book discussions. And I know in Canada there's the BBC sponsors this Canada Reads, and to me, this is exactly the kind of novel that should be that book, because it raises all sorts of, from imperialism to cultural appropriation to an act of kindness that really turns bad, or turns unfortunate at best. I hope they choose that.
Well, I didn't, I couldn't have come up with an answer for that question, and I don't, I don't think that question is easy to answer. So
Right.
I think that you're right, that it's maybe, I hope it is a, a provocation for conversation or for thinking even. But I also, it wasn't just the medicine that I wanted to give in the book. I
No, I would,
also
yeah.
wanted to give that delight of, both the ocean and also of a suddenly acquired younger brother, for a lonely child who didn't have anybody, and how much she loves him.
Are you a big armchair traveler or a big traveler in real life or?
And I've been so lucky. I've been a big traveler lately. Because I was working on this book, I was able to, I was given a shirk grant, which is, I guess, it's sort of like NEA, and was able to travel again to the South Seas, to go to Fiji and Tonga again, and New Zealand, and to see, and to Hong Kong, and other places in China and Bali. And I've really been so lucky over the last few years. Especially, it seems especially lucky now when we're all just starving for the ability to go anywhere. And responsibly, and knowing that it's best not going anywhere, but it makes me hungry for going more. Although I have to say that I'm also getting a little older, and I'm now less, probably, it's sad because like I've missed the last couple of years of travel, and I'm now getting to the point where I don't really want to go places where there's no bathroom.
Right,
I just want,
right,
I
right.
don't want to go somewhere where I'm not sure of anything. And that has been a real pleasure lately.
Yeah.
I have armchair traveled in Europe though, because although I lived in England for a time, I never made it over to Europe. So I'm jealous of everybody who can.
Is there a favorite armchair travel writer or somebody who you so much wish you had had, his or her their experiences?
Well, Bruce Chatwin,
Yeah,
Patrick Lee Firmer,
right.
you notice that they're mostly men. Lately, because they were able to go, but lately I really loved Mary Norris's wonderful book, Greek to Me,
Mhm.
where she goes to Greece multiple times. And I've always longed to go to Greece, of course, because as you know from the book, I too I'm a bit of uh, an aficionado of the language.
Right. My husband and I have for many years have gone every summer to England to do one of the long distance walks, and but we couldn't. Of course, we're supposed to do the Ridgeway this year, this summer, but we can't. I mean, of course, we couldn't. And now I'm thinking, oh, I'm getting old. I wonder whether I can do as much as I used to.
The world is getting old along with us. And so, people are finding lovely ways in order to facilitate continuing to travel, even when you don't feel like walking 17 miles anymore in a row. But I hope you do get to do the Ridgeway. That would be.
Well, I've been saying that if the minute that we can travel again to England, I'm gonna just hop on a plane, in what we would say a New York minute, to do that walk, because I need to do that. Was this of your novels, was this the one that needed the most research?
Well, I wrote a book about vaudeville.
Right.
And I think that in terms of book research, they were about the same. I did an enormous amount of research with vaudeville, mostly because I just was enjoying it. It was such a strange, um, encapsulated art form. You know, it only existed between these very narrow parameters, and I read everything. Um, but but this one was much more wide ranging. For example, I had to learn about sails
Right.
and about ships, and you know, you think that, so well, that'll be a couple of weeks in the library, but it was years. And even so, I still would find things that I didn't know or that I'd got wrong, and I hope I found all of them. I was kind of lucky that I had a 12-year-old girl to blame things on if she got it wrong. And then of course, I didn't really intend, you know, I'm not writing from a very strict plan, and I didn't intend to have a second voyage there. So then I had to learn all about steamships, and that was another enormous job. But the research is never the problem. It's always very enjoyable. The job is to make the research part of your understanding of the world, and then to write the book.
Yes, yes, to make it effortless, to make it appear as though there was no formal research, but you just knew all this.
You don't want any of that stuff showing at all, do you?
No, you don't. You know who told me about The Little Shadows, your vaudeville book, was Guy Gavriel Kay.
Oh, did he? Now that he's a good fan for me, as I am for him.
Yes.
Yeah, he's a wonderful writer, and I remember vividly reading his first trilogy while walking down Philosopher's Walk at U of T, which is where his teenagers are snatched up from. That's very kind of him to talk about it.
Yeah, yes, he said, oh, you must read that, Nancy. And so now I get to be a fan of both of yours.
Wow.
When you're working on a book, do you write regularly? You know, people are always so interested in the ABCs, the kind of craft of a writer.
I mean, it is interesting, and yet it doesn't seem to be transferable. It's like you can't find out how somebody else works, and then you can do that. My friend Miriam Taves works from like 8 o'clock in the morning till 11, and then she's finished. She says it's like cleaning toilets: get in, get out. And that totally doesn't work for me.
That statement sounds just like her books.
I know. It is exactly like.
That's perfect.
How I work is I work regular hours. Oh my God, yes. I got into the habit of working at 5 when my children were small. And so I still do that. I still get up very early and work. And then I work until somebody needs to be fed in the evening. And then I often go back to work after that, because I'm just very slow. I find it requires an awful lot of staring at the screen and going, this is stupid, before I'm able to get the next bit coughed up. And first drafts are just horrifyingly awful. I mean, I hate writing first drafts. It's just physically painful. It's like spinning silk out of your own body, and it's physically exhausting, I find it, and it's also emotionally depleting. But then second drafts and the further on with the drafts, I love that work, and it's there's no reason not to be at your desk, because you know what the job is. It's the first draft when you're exploring outward and trying to figure out what you're doing is hard.
Was there one of your novels that was easier than the other for a first draft?
That's such a good question. None of them I would call easy, but I actually think that by the time I got to writing with this book, it might have been the fastest first draft, because it took so long to go through the research process and to understand not just ships and the sea and the various ports that they were going to, but also to be grounded in the philosophical ideas and religious ideas of the time, to understand about the church and the missionary system in the South Pacific. That took an awfully long time. So it seemed as if I wasn't writing. And when I finally broke through and was actually writing, it was maybe less than a year to do the first draft. And I think that's the fastest.
When you were sitting with all of that information, or with a story that your piano teacher, that you learned about your piano teacher's mother and the real incident that the Voyage of the Morning Light is based on. Did when did the characters come to you? I know you said that Kay, who's the 12-year-old girl, came kind of late, right, in the process.
Yes. My piano teacher was quite a character. She was in 1974 an irascible, jowly, horrible old woman with a very cutting tongue and a brilliant piano teacher, alone in the world, and only had a little dog. She was very grouchy. One day she reached out because I hadn't practiced and twizzled my nose, said "scallywag," and my nose bled.
Oh my
Blood poured
God.
out of it. So she put me to bed in her own bed while the next lesson went on, while she waited for my father to come pick me up. And I went through her drawers and I thought about her a lot. And although she was, in some ways awful, she was also magnificent. And um, she was like I imagine Kay to be as an old woman.
Mhm.
And so I think what I was putting back into the book was my teacher that I knew, this woman that I knew who had created a life on her own terms and lived on her own, in her own way. Very intelligent, very not particularly good with people, but also kind, and I think probably quite a loving person.
You know, some writers talk about how their characters go off in their own directions, and the writers, when they're talking about this, say how surprised they are that their character did that. And when I hear that, I'm always reminded that Vladimir Nabokov talked about, someone asked him that question, and he said that his characters were his galley slaves. So my question to you is, which side of that do you
Galley slaves
fall?
or free spirits?
Right.
They're mostly galley slaves for me too. They don't talk to me or any of those things. I think that'd be great because then your work would be pretty much done. Um, but they do sometimes surprise me, and how they surprise me usually is just by turning up.
In between writing, in between your finished books, do you get nervous about that you have so many ideas that you'll never get them all down, or that you have no idea for your next book, or time is getting away from you?
The ideas are always crowding up against the door, clamoring to be written, and so I'm not worried about ideas, but I find writing so difficult that I sometimes worry whether I'll have the necessary grit to do it again. A surgeon does 15 appendectomies. They're probably going to get a little better at appendectomies, but each book is a totally different book. And so, I'm better at I know myself better now, so I'm better at some things, but each book I have to learn how to write each book again. Um, I'm, I'm I'm working on something a little bit more autobiographical than normally. I'm drawing from my own experience this time on a new book called The Observer, and I'm worried about how to make sure that I'm honest enough always. I just worry about. I think it's not memoir; it's fiction, but it's still, that constant question about how do you work from real life and yet make it still true in fiction. I've been watching The Queen's Gambit. Have you watched it?
I'm waiting for a time that I can, just enjoy it. I loved that book.
It is an amazing. I'll be really interested to hear what you think of the difference between the two. I haven't yet read the book, but I'm going to go find it now. And I was reading about Walter Tevis and shocked to find how closely his own childhood mirrors The Queen's Gambit.
Yes.
And so that was really, you know, some you get these, you see a movie or you read a book that really helps you going forward. And so I feel actually better today because we finished The Queen's Gambit last night, and I'm so impressed with what he did with his own material and how he definitely, it's definitely been synthesized. It's art, not
Right.
memoir.
Yes. Yes.
But also it's so the links with his own life are very clear.
I just want to ask one quick question because we don't have a lot of time left, unfortunately. When you were writing The Little Shadows, your book about three sisters in vaudeville and their mother, was it the characters who came to you first? Because that,
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Those are the girls in the fairy tale, the three sisters in the fairy tales. But also, I had three sisters myself, and
Oh.
so I had been thinking about those girls and their mother all my life. And going through, I was in theater before I began to write, and so I was also drawing on all those young girls in theater and the lives that they are embarking upon without having any idea of the risks and the difficulties and the joys and the complications.
don't you think that we all start out not knowing? We make these decisions and we don't know the joys and complications and what's going to happen to us.
Because you
Right.
might try to change it if you knew them all, but you can't. There's nobody can tell you. It's like having children, you know, nobody can actually explain to you how difficult and impossible and crazily wonderful this is going to be,
Yes.
no matter how hard they try. I guess this is why books are good, because sometimes we can get a little bit of an ink.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marina. My guest today on Book Lust, which we filmed at Folio in downtown Seattle, has been Canadian novelist Marina Endicott. And her new book, which I highly recommend for book groups, is The Voyage of the Morning Light.